Howdy, all you delicious people. Welcome back to Season 4 of The Last Man on Earth, the first 6 episodes. So, immediately when I go into these first episodes, I feel like it's very Pamela heavy. I also kind of do consistently laugh and or scoff at the fact that we consistently have characters that keep ending up being added onto this show that end up getting killed seemingly seconds after they are introduced, which I think is hilarious. We we end up in this show having it be that there is quite a bit of time that has passed, I guess, from the last season to now this season, because we end up having it to ultimately it seems that Carol is much more pregnant, and it seems that she is going to eventually have to, within these 6 episodes, going to have to give birth. We end up having it to ultimately Carol and Erica's pregnancies are kind of going to have to forcibly be compared. And there are some hilarious moments kind of coming out of that. It seems like some of the group is starting to really just get burnt out with one another. Like some characters are really wanting to really actually go their separate ways, and we end up having to where Phil and Carol are just like, well, no, how about we like kind of just spend more time together? And ultimately, they're just like, yeah, no, like we end up having it to where Melissa and Phil are ultimately really running themselves ragged. Um, we ultimately have a really scary moment with Todd within these 6 episodes. Um, and we ultimately have it to where seemingly that people are trying to be a little bit creative with some of the writing that is to go on here. But reasonably, I can also say that they try to use one gag and like really stretch that gag out, which ultimately can be fun for some people, but I'm kind of finding it a little bit annoying. I would like there to be like I I miss the fact that we used to just experiment. That we used to just like some of the funnest moments to me were probably some of the dumbest moments as well. To just experiment told me have people that are just having fun and are um, taking a car and ramming it into another car, or uh, going and chucking 30 bowling balls from the back of a truck to be tossed into fish tanks. I thought that those moments were hilarious. I thought they were fun. Um, we still get that moment a little bit here, but I can't help but think also that it seems that everybody is also in like parenting mode within this show, so it's kind of having to tailor people from having fun to reasonably just um, there's much more story to be cared about within these episodes. So, kind of the fun takes a back seat to the story, which ultimately is bound to happen. Um, Other than that, I would say that there is some interesting things going on with this season, but I can't help but also say that it's kind of like, man, like the early episodes in the early season was so much fun. This season is just kind of winding down. You could kind of just tell how they're just really either running out of ideas or ultimately just kind of running out of just like they're running out of gas. Like I think it's just like, man, when you're relying on the story instead of having fun within these episodes, that's when it's just kind of like, oh, okay, well, I guess like we really want to take this show seriously, so to speak, in a comedic standpoint. So going in here, I think that's all I wanted to say about this in a very cryptic like sense, of course, making it to my 5 minute mark. So let's go on into the double five timed territory and start going to spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this review. So we end up having it to where ultimately Pamela is to open up last season with ultimately shooting Pat. So we end up finding out that seemingly Pamela had a character that was played by Jack Black, who was supposedly some bizarrish captain that ultimately Pamela had found. Immediately, it seems that ultimately there had been opened up gunfire that ultimately uh, had lit up Jack. Jack Black to ultimately kill him off. Because ultimately Pamela accidentally kept firing upon her gun, and Jack was ultimately led to be killed. So we end up having it to ultimately they are to make, of course, a funeral for both Pat and his captain. And so we end up having it to where Phil is going and guaranteeing that Pat is never going to come back by um, by chopping off his head, putting his head on one jet ski, and putting Pat's body on another jet ski. And so they end up trying to shoot these things out onto the ocean, and they end up going and they end up colliding with one another. And ultimately, they're just like, well, I guess that's good enough. To ultimately just like, yeah, I guess that's gonna be a good enough ceremony for Pat. So we eventually end up having it to where ultimately uh, Pamela ends up going upon this boat, and we eventually have it to where eventually Pamela ends up taking control of the boat because while the group is eventually finding that there is an island present, uh, because Gale ultimately messes up the boat. Um, because ultimately they didn't put an anchor in place correctly. They just kept floating on, and ultimately Gale or Melissa doesn't know exactly where they had landed or where they were going to land. So we end up having it to ultimately the group is to go to this island, and so they end up taking a boat, a smaller boat, like a life raft ish, like just a smaller boat, to go onto this island to see if they can kind of collect resources because they're starting to run out of things. So the funny thing is here we consistently see Jasper with different kind of costumes on. At one scene, we end up having it to where Jasper is wearing a Hulk costume. In another scene, we're ending up having him wear like a superhero or a Superman costume, and so on and so forth. Every single time I see Jasper, he looks like kind of funny just because ultimately we consistently see this kid wearing consistent different costumes every time we see him. So I thought it was really interesting. So we end up having it to ultimately once the group ends up reaching the island, we end up having it to where ultimately Pamela ends up going and clocking Phil on the head with um, some uh, uh, device of sorts. I don't know what it's called exactly. It's like a rower, like a thing that you kind of row with your boat gently down the stream, I'm sure. We end up having to where Pamela hits Phil with this, knocking him out, and then she ends up taking the boat and driving off in boat terms. So we end up having it to ultimately Phil is ultimately now tied up, and Phil is ultimately saying, well, maybe I can try to make it to where ultimately Pamela will think that I'm infatuated with her, to where she'll untie me, and so on and so forth. Maybe it'll be like the whatever the syndrome is, where ultimately you end up having to be taken hostage for too long, that otherwise you start to sympathize with your kidnapper, and so on and so forth. We end up having to, or eventually Phil is to ultimately tell Pamela that he's starting to get confused about who is his lover, whether it's Pamela or whether it's Carol. Ultimately, we end up having it to where he kind of mixes the two names, where it's like Caparla, Capamela, Caparla, or whatever he ends up saying. Kind of confusing which names of a person which he loves. To ultimately make it to where it seems that Pamela is otherwise going to fall for um, Phil's schemes, where ultimately she's like, oh, well, maybe he does love me. So we end up having a tour eventually. Phil is to get loose from his tying, and we end up having a tour. Phil plans to create a ruckus that's going to make Pamela go and uh, drop her gun and find out where Phil is. And we end up having a troll ultimately. Pamela ends up finding Phil, and Phil has Pamela's dog. Ultimately, to threaten that he is going to eat the dog unless Pamela gives her gun up. And ultimately, Pamela's like, no, you're not going to do that because that dog is adorable. Look at its face. How could you eat the face of a dog that looks like that? And ultimately, that's when Phil ultimately mentions, like, well, I'm not going to eat his face. I'm going to eat his butt. And so we end up having it to where Phil directs and turns the dog to ultimately show his butt. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to eat his butt. I'm going to do it. And so we end up having to where Pamela's like, you monster. And ultimately she ends up giving Phil her gun. So ultimately Phil will ultimately take the boat and try to make his way back to Carol. The only problem is he doesn't know exactly how to get back to her, because he's like, So ultimately he doesn't see the island anywhere. They've gone too far. So, but we end up having to where luckily Phil ends up making his way back, luckily, to the island. So we eventually have the group making their way to this island, and there's ultimately a new character there called Glenn, which ultimately I have seen him in, I think, the movie Cabin Boy and Groundhog's Day, and quite a few other things, like something about Mary and stuff like that. But anyways, we end up having the group ultimately going and meeting this Glenn character that ultimately has really been on the island for 5 years. So this is like a castaway Tom Hanks situation, where ultimately we end up having this guy who bizarrely makes a woman out of sticks and and coconuts and all kinds of things. And ultimately we end up having it to where this guy supposedly makes a love doll out of this school. So he's just like, yeah, like I couldn't find, there was never a woman here. So ultimately I had to figure out how to uh, make someone. So we end up having it to where eventually uh, this Glenn character does not know about the whole virus situation. Eventually they have to come clean to him and eventually tell him about the virus, because ultimately he's like, dude, I've been waiting for a plane or a boat or something to come. And ultimately we have it to where eventually they break the news to him that ultimately everyone he knows is probably dead. So we end up having it to ultimately we end up having Phil making his way back to the island, and so ultimately we end up having it to where uh, they're deciding whether or not to leave Pamela on this island or not, so that way she could suffer just like Glenn did. Ultimately, they end up deciding that they are going to keep Pamela with them, but ultimately she is going to be on that little boat that ultimately they had come into that island on, but um, like she is going to be tied to the boat, and ultimately she's not actually going to be really part of the boat. We end up having it to where Glenn ultimately saying like, well, hey, well, us having that little boat is kind of tied to us, is kind of dragging us down, it's kind of slowing us down, and we ultimately need as much speed as we can get. So they take Pamela into into the ship ultimately because they forcibly have to, and so we end up making our way seemingly into Mexico. Uh, Ultimately, we end up having it to where I guess that is the most safest place from the radioactive blast zone area, and so we end up having these characters end up just excited about being able to be back on land. Ultimately, we end up having it to where Phil makes a song about it. Ultimately, in the exact same freaking I don't know how many, like, we've had twice now within these 6 episodes where ultimately we have Phil ultimately using that exact same closure, 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 that song, and ultimately adding different lyrics to it this time around. Ultimately, we have Phil who makes a song about them all going to Mexico, and whoop de doo. So we seemingly end up finding out that ultimately all of the group is all going to be living in one mansion, and we have to have a backstory about this mansion. Ultimately, having seemingly some uh, kind of mafia-ish like characters that are going and killing people off. I don't think any of these characters are actually having any real relevancy. It's ultimately to just um, tie one thing into this, which ultimately is some Rubik's Cube, that ultimately is some bomb. Absurdly. It makes no sense. So we end up having that whole backstory about this mansion. On top of that, it's a whole backstory about some people that ultimately had threatened somebody to go and uh, smack a pinata um, that could quite have possibly had a bomb in it, but it didn't. That whole stupid thing backstory was just so absurd. Um, but it was in the show for reasons I don't quite understand. So moving on. So we end up having it to where eventually within the show that it seems that Gail and everybody else are just kind of wanting to separate with everybody. It seems that Melissa and Todd are ending up going and having a lot of SEX adventures where ultimately they are to kind of do some role playing, and we end up having it to where Melissa ends up going into these weird and bizarrish role plays of sorts that ended up making no sense. Todd is severely confused. Every single time, ultimately, she's like, well, hey, like, um, this is going utterly awry, and there's only one way that you're going to be able to pay me off, Todd. And Todd's like, well, how am I going to be able to do that? And she's like, take off your pants. And so Todd ends up having to just eventually just really run himself down by this seemingly consistent thromp of both Melissa and Todd going at it repetitiously. So Carol ultimately is to give seemingly the group walkie-talkies because ultimately she wants to not be separated from one another. But eventually we end up having it to where Carol ends up playing a prank on everybody. To ultimately say, like, Carol saying to Gail, oh my god, I think I'm having a baby. I think my water broke. Oh my god. So we end up having it to where Gail is running to try and get to um, Phil and Carol, because ultimately it seems like they are having to forcibly make a pregnancy. We end up having Gail making her way ultimately to see that ultimately uh, Carol had already delivered the baby. But we end up finding out that ultimately, when Carol ends up kind of revealing the baby, it's actually Phil, ultimately with his head going, ah, like, I'm a baby. Was like, so we end up having the entire group all running to get to Carol, and ultimately we end up having it to where, like, it's a big old lie, and everybody's like, oh my god, like, I thought that something serious was happening. So we after this end up having it to ultimately Erica and Gail end up playing a prank back onto um, onto Carol and Phil to get even. We end up having it to where Carol ultimately is uh, had her leg in some bear trap, which actually isn't true, and we end up having it to where Gail ends up falling down a well with snakes or something like that. It's stupid. We end up having to ultimately Todd mentions that ultimately he thinks that he's having seemingly like shortness of breath, or ultimately that because ultimately he went to go and grab energy drinks, because ultimately he's very run down from being with Melissa, and so we end up having it toward Todd mentioning about shortness of breath and stuff like that, and so um, Melissa says, "Oh, that's a good one." Ultimately, we end up having it to where Melissa mentions that she's getting attacked by chupacabras, and ultimately Todd is like, you know what, I feel like there's something really wrong, and we are to naturally assume that Todd is actually having a heart attack right here and there, and so we end up having it to ultimately Todd is to mention the safe word, which is Wisconsin, and Melissa goes scrambling. She's like, "Oh my god, like he's really having problems," and so I was kind of scared because I'm like, dude, do not kill off Todd. Like, Todd is freaking amazing. Like, I think he's a very lovable character, and everybody really likes him. Um, so we end up having it to ultimately Todd is to seemingly go into needing like oxygen and all this kinds of stuff, but eventually it seems that he bounces back. It seems that Melissa doesn't think so, and so ultimately she's trying as much as humanly possible to take care of him, basically by putting a like a helmet on his head, put him in a wheelchair, and all kinds of things. Ultimately, just trying to make it so that this guy does not get hurt at all. To where Todd is ultimately just like, dude, I can't do anything, because Melissa will come in and say like, oh, well, hey, are you straining yourself? And Todd's like, dude, I'm just trying to like relax. I'm just trying to get into a vibe of things. And ultimately, Melissa's just trying to just drive Todd crazy. So we end up having it to ultimately we find out that Carol had supposedly given birth in her sleep. We end up having it to where Carol wakes up and there's a baby from right from under her. And so we end up having it to ultimately Carol is to introduce her new baby to the group. And ultimately Carol is like, well, yeah, I just slept and just had a baby. I didn't even feel it. And ultimately, like Carol had mentioned, like, oh, I thought I maybe gave myself a big O as well. And so Erica is like, God, I really hate the fact that her pregnancy was so easy because mine wasn't. So we end up finding out that ultimately Carol thinks that there might be something wrong with her. And so ultimately, we end up having to where Gail ends up going and having an ultrasound, and ultimately, they end up finding out that supposedly there's another baby in the oven. So we end up finding out that Carol had twins. So we end up having it to where eventually that while Gail and Phil are both arguing, it seems that Carol ends up just popping out yet another baby, and so ultimately she's just having like babies like it's nothing. And so Erica's like, again, she's bitter as F about this because like, I want her pregnancy to be difficult. I want her pregnancy to be painful. I want like I'm wondering how like God like Erica is just so bitter as F about the pregnancy of all this and how it's not like the way that she wants. Like she wants Carol to be as in just as much pain as Erica was. It's hilarious. So we end up having it to ultimately really, I think that's really a bulk of what all actually happens within these 6 episodes. Um, yeah, I thought that this episode or these episodes were they were just kind of like recently there was a lot of times where I was just like, man, like this show, like I miss the early seasons. Like I miss when we had two Phils. Like I wish like I miss the like the simple things where they were just going um and trying to rigor their homes to ultimately make it to where they can better survive. I like the small things where it was just kind of like, hey, let's try to survive via these episodes. Like the whole episode where Todd and Phil were sharing bacon together, I thought was like the hilarious thing of eventually Todd finding food, then eventually Phil going and sharing it with the entire group um, to ultimately have Todd seem like a hero to the group. Um, Now we're just kind of either introducing characters or ultimately we're just like kind of like that's all we're really doing is just introducing characters. Ultimately, a lot of characters that aren't exactly having a good amount of things going on with them. We end up having it to where eventually Glenn and Pamela ending up seemingly or cementingly having a relationship. It seems that both Pamela and Phil are giving themselves some bedroom business in here. Because ultimately we end up having to our Pamela is mentioning the group that ultimately she is cleaning, and it's like ultimately the entire group is like, I don't know what that was last night, but that is not at all sounding like cleaning. And so we end up having it to ultimately when Glenn is to go back into uh in onto dry land, he's ultimately realizing that everybody he has loved is probably gone, and so ultimately we have it to where Glenn is ultimately having to mourn the fact that he's lost everyone. Like he had been on an island for 5 years with a lot and lost everyone, but eventually when he comes back to the states or to the world, so to speak, ultimately he is still that same guy on that island with just a few more people that ultimately he has to try to figure out what he's going to do next. Um, I kind of like the fact that it seems that Glenn isn't going to be a overpowering character. Because I always have a problem when they end up introducing a brand new character to here because we end up having it to where every single time we end up having a new character. That new character ends up having to be overwhelmingly a prominent thing, kind of like how Pamela was. Um, like I think kind of Glenn might be able to just kind of get by by not having to be killed off. I'm assessing that probably Glenn and probably Pamela towards somewhere in the season are eventually going to have to get killed off at some point because they're technically the newest characters. It'll be interesting to eventually like. I'm kind of seeing that I think that Gail and Erica may end up as just a couple, which will be interesting. I think with the whole like baby situation and with the uh, like with the whole convenience of it just being like, well, I guess Gail and Pamela are just gonna become a couple because it's just convenient. But other than that, I think that is all that I wanted to say within these episodes. I think there was not much else I could have mentioned. If anything, I think they end up accidentally leaving Jasper on that island, which I found was hilarious. As well as Gail ultimately was saying like how important it was for her to have a pair of glasses that ultimately she was going to go back to the island to go and get and we end up leaving out Jasper, and ultimately Todd ultimately mentions like, well, hey guys, we have to go back to the island because ultimately Jasper is still back there. Um, Eventually, it'll be interesting to see what happens with the rest of the season. I kind of wish they would go back to the way things were, where it's just simpler times. We end up having to eventually. Phil ends up experimenting on how to make his home safer for a child, to where I guess the baby won't fall down the stairs and hurt itself. To where ultimately Phil ends up riggering a entire thing of stairs made out of bubble wrap or whatever, like kind of packaging materials, which I thought was hilarious. Other than that, I think that's all that I wanted to say about these this episodes. Just funny, fun still, but I just kind of miss those early episodes. I kind of miss when characters would just be on their own and just kind of just experiment or otherwise just kind of have a goal in mind to benefit the group. I kind of miss those episodes. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.